Welcome on back to The Reckoning. Into the next half of the hour we go, and I'm glad to be joined now by Representative Don Mayhew. He is currently in the Missouri House running for Senate District 16 down there in our 107.3 listening area, and a lifelong rural Missourian, an engineer, small business owner. He's been in the House for 7 years and has a pretty solid conservative record behind him. I think you're the only engineer in the Missouri House. Did I understand that correctly? Representative Mayhew, thank you for being on with me.
That is correct, and I'm the only engineer and only one of two surveyors.
One of two surveyors. Well, I'll take that. You're in a long line of a good legacy there from George Washington on down, that surveyor line.
That's right. Absolutely.
Well, I'm glad to catch up with you. One of our listeners specifically asked me to reach out to the candidates in District 16. I know there's a big four-way primary going on down there, but you've been in the House 7 years now, and, as far as I go down the list, there's a lot of pretty solid opinions that you've got. In fact, I see, looks like gambling and gambling special interest may be one of the biggest factors in your race as far as, what your record is in the House and some of your opponents. But I'd love to hear what led you to this. Obviously, you're terming out of the House, but what decided to, put your hat in the ring for District 16 for the Senate?
Well, it was partially that. I mean, we've had pretty solid gridlock in the Senate almost the entire time I've been in the House of Representatives, and it's about time that the grown-ups took over on the Senate side, and so the other issue is that the Senate has contributed a lot to let's just say it like it is, spending money that would make a drunken sailor embarrassed. And, burnt through $6.5 billion in reserve, took our budget all the way to $54 billion. And, we've now finally, we're starting to cut. Here's the truth. The state of Missouri doesn't have a revenue problem. It's got a spending problem. And now this last year was pretty tough on cuts, mainly through efforts by the House of Representatives. I'm on budget, been on there for 8 years. We finally did some real cutting, and next year it's going to hurt a lot worse, but it's way past due.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Way past due. That's of course one of the big things, and I'm going to get your take on this because you sit in, I think, an interesting position. First of all, on the budget committee, that's where a lot of big decisions have been, needed. And of course, the same is going to be true, especially next year with Auditor Fitzpatrick's warnings about our budget surplus and, or I should say our fund surplus and how that's diminishing so quickly. But one of the big questions, of course, that faces us all, I'd love to get your take on this. I saw, you are opposing Amendment 5 as a vote, but you did vote to pass it through in its final form to send this amendment to the ballot. I'm curious, was that a change of heart, or was it I might disagree with it, but I'll let the people vote on it? I'm curious on your take on that.
Well, so yes, it was. That's too big of a decision for politicians to make, and I felt like that the people needed to have a voice on it. Now, I'm a big advocate of the fair tax. I always have been, and in fact, I was working on a bill that would have given us the fair tax, and leadership decided that we didn't want to go that direction. And I got a little bit of the logic. I mean, really, truthfully, my bill couldn't have taken effect until the Constitution changed anyway. But my argument for it was, well, we've done this before, where we've passed something legislatively that was contingent on the Constitution changing, and so we can do both. However, leadership felt like they didn't want the spotlight, to be on two bills at the same time, was afraid that it would cause some confusion. But here's the reality, and this is what I said: unless people know what it is that they're buying, they're not going to vote for it. Mm-hmm. And the biggest fear that I have, including me and others have, and this is pretty much what voters have explained to me, is that, we're pretty familiar with how it works up in Jeff City. He who has the highest price lobbyist gets the exception. So, a lot of folks are concerned that, the lawyers and the CPAs and the stockbrokers are all getting an exception out of the fair tax, and the barbers and the surveyors and the engineers will end up holding the bag. And I honestly, I share that same concern because I'm pretty familiar with how Jeff City works.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I mean, that's going to be a big thing. If Amendment 5 passes, that immediately is going to cast all eyes on the General Assembly to put forward a bill. And I've actually said something similar. I used a different analogy. It feels like I'm being asked for a business loan without being allowed to see the plan just yet. Although I understand the constitutional distinction that needs to change. Otherwise, the potential plan they want to go with isn't even allowed constitutionally. I understand that. But that's going to immediately cast a huge view on the General Assembly. And there, a lot of hangups often happen in the Senate where you're asking to go.
Yeah. And so that's why I pledged that I would, if it does pass, that I would not vote for. In fact, I would fight against any tax that included a raise in the sales tax. Because we don't need it if there are no exceptions across the board. Everybody's paying on this thing. Then we could likely see the sales tax go down. But that's sometimes that's a big hurdle for some of our friends over in the Senate to get over, and so that we need people up there who are going to make sure that we stick to what the governor said. 3 exceptions, and that's it.
Well, let me ask you this, because this is obviously the next biggest one. You're intricately involved in the process. Obviously, we've got we have some decent conservative bulldogs in the House. There's a few in the Senate, but it is not the majority even of our Republican caucus that makes up the supermajority of the votes. So should something like this pass or fail, either one, what is the reality, do you think, for the will that you sense among your colleagues there? What's the reality of actually tackling spending in a significant way, making cuts that people aren't going to like, going across the board? I'd love to see every single part and piece of what government spends take a hit, because this just needs a wholesale, we're spending billions more than we have ultimately over time. This needs a wholesale approach. Is there really a will to get that done amongst both bodies?
Well, so surgical cuts are what we really need. Unfortunately, what we've done in the past is these kind of across the board 10% kind of things, to try to avoid the whining and crying from one department or another. But here's the truth, folks, and we need to face the facts. We have a $500 million hole in our budget caused by Medicaid expansion. President Trump, with H.R. 1, gave us a little bit of breathing room on that issue, because now we can put a work requirement on these Medicaid expansion folks. Those are able-bodied people, and there's 368,000 of them out there who are not working, because if you had a job, you would not be eligible for Medicaid expansion. The state of Missouri alone has 3,500 open positions. Well, those aren't bad jobs. So how come these people ain't going to work? So we need to address that problem in a very emphatic way. Like I said, that's $500 million hole in our budget. Now, the other thing we got to do is we got to go in and trim back on all this extra GR ask that was put into the budget just from bills that we passed since I've been in the legislature. So that amounts to almost $2.5 billion of brand new GR ask, things that was done since 2019. So in 8 years, we've added $2.5 billion ourselves with legislation. So some of those things we need to go back and take another good hard look at. Other than that, there is some belt tightening that can be done in our departments without affecting services. The other thing is efficiencies. Where is all the efficiencies that was promised by the new software and things like that? So we need to figure out why we're not getting the efficiency out of those systems that we've already paid a lot of money for. And so some hard questions need to be asked. And I'm pretty famous for asking the hard questions of our bureaucrats.
Well, and I'll give it to you the last 60 or so seconds. Let me ask you, Representative Don Mayhew, again in the House, currently running for Senate District 16. What differentiates you from the primary field that you are facing between now and next Tuesday? Why should voters hand this to you in the primary to move forward in Senate District 16?
Well, I've been endorsed by the NRA. I'm a NRAA Plus and Missouri Right to Life. I'm also the only candidate who is not supported by big money lobbyists and special interest groups. I'm going to go to Jeff City and I'm going to work for you. I'm not going to work for the lobbyists. And that's what I've done since I've been in the House of Representatives, and I'll continue doing that.
Excellent. Folks, you can follow along. He's on Facebook and X. Just look for Don Mayhew, mayhewformissouri.com. That's mayhewformissouri.com. Representative Mayhew, thank you for taking a few minutes and giving us some time. We wish you all the best in your election.
Hey, I appreciate it. Thanks for it.
Absolutely. Folks, big decisions and some of those Senate races, we've got a lot of them across the state. These are going to be biggies that matter because, like I said, Amendment 4, Amendment 5, whether they fail or pass, either one, we need more oversight, more bulldogs for conservative values in both of our houses of the legislature. Absolutely necessary. We'll be back on The Reckoning. More ahead in the next segment.